A poor young woman, Mary, accidentally texts a millionaire CEO, Ethan, begging for money to buy milk for her baby. What Ethan does next will stun everyone. Before we begin the story, leave us a comment telling us where you're watching from and don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Mary clutched her phone, feeling the weight of desperation press down on her. Her eyes darted from the screen to the makeshift bassinet in the living room, where her 4-month-old son, Leo, cried incessantly from hunger. She took a deep breath, trying to conjure a solution, any solution, but there was no way out. The money was gone, bills were overdue, and there wasn't even a single can of formula left on the shelf. Swallowing her pride, Mary decided to plead for help from the last person she wanted to contact, Mark, Leo's father. He was a man who had turned his back the moment he learned of her pregnancy and had since pretended she and the baby didn't exist. She knew begging him for help was humiliating, but looking at Leo, his tiny face red from so much crying, she realized her pride couldn't outweigh her son's needs. She took a deep breath, tears blurring her vision as she started typing, "Mark, I know you don't want anything to do with me, but I have no other option. Leo is crying from hunger, I need $50 to buy formula, and I'll pay you back as soon as I get paid. I started working at Walker Enterprises 2 weeks ago, and I'm really uncomfortable asking for an advance, please help me, not for me but for our son." Her fingers hovered over the send button for a few seconds, she hesitated, but then she pressed send. Her chest tightened immediately, but as she looked back at the screen, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The phone number was wrong. Her eyes widened, panic rising like a wave. No, this can't be happening," she whispered, clutching her phone to her chest. She quickly looked again and yes, the message hadn't gone to Mark, it had gone to a strange number. She tried to delete it, to do something, but it was too late. 2 blue ticks had appeared, the other person had read it. Her heart pounded, her hands grew even sweatier, a million thoughts raced through her mind. Oh my God, how will they respond? What if they insult me? She squeezed her eyes shut, took a deep breath, trying to keep calm, completely unaware that the number didn't belong to just any stranger. It belonged to Ethan, the CEO of Walker Enterprises, the same company where Mary had just started working as a cleaning lady 2 weeks prior. And in that very moment, her life was about to change forever. A few minutes later, Mary's phone vibrated in her hand, making her heart jump. She took a deep breath before looking at the screen. The message read, "I don't think this message was for me." Her face flushed, her cheeks burning instantly, a mix of shame and despair washing over her. "I'm so sorry, please ignore this message, it was a mistake, I sent it to the wrong person, I'm truly sorry," she typed quickly, hoping it would all just disappear. She pressed send, praying that would be the end of it, but before she could even breathe, another notification popped up on her screen. "Do you really need formula for your baby?" Mary hesitated, looking at Leo in the bassinet still crying softly, his tiny hands flailing in the air for the comfort she couldn't provide at the moment. She took a deep breath and replied, almost begging for the conversation to end, "Please don't worry, it was a mistake, I'll figure it out, I apologize for bothering you." The silence lasted only a few seconds until another message arrived, more direct, more insistent, and completely unexpected. "Send me your address, I'll bring the formula myself." She blinked, rereading it, thinking she must have misunderstood. Her hands started to sweat, her mind reeled, this couldn't be happening. "Really, it's not necessary, honestly, I'll manage, it was just a mistake, I'm truly sorry," she replied, her face burning. But his response was even more insistent, "Send your address now." Mary stood frozen for a few seconds, her pride screamed at her not to accept, but Leo's cries were tearing at her heart. She looked at the bassinet, clutched the phone in her hand, took a deep breath, and typed the address. Just a few minutes later, she heard a car pull up outside her building. She went to the window and pulled back the curtain, then stood completely speechless. A sleek black luxury car was parked directly in front of the humble building where she lived. It looked like it didn't even belong in the neighborhood. A few seconds later, the door opened, and a tall man in a perfectly tailored suit with an elegant demeanor and a serious expression stepped out of the car accompanied by 2 security personnel. He walked confidently, carrying 2 large bags in his hands. Right behind him, another security person was unloading several boxes from the trunk. Mary didn't know if she should open the door, run away, or wake up from this dream or nightmare. Her heart was pounding so hard she felt like the whole building could hear it. The doorbell rang, she took a deep breath, adjusted her hair, and slowly opened the door. The moment her eyes met his, a chill ran down her body. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He stood straight, looked directly into her eyes, and replied in a deep, steady but surprisingly calm voice, "Ethan." The world seemed to spin, this couldn't be real. She knew that name, Ethan, the CEO of Walker Enterprises, the same place she had just started working as a cleaning lady 2 weeks prior. The shock was so intense that she had to hold on to the doorknob to keep from losing her balance. Without another word, Ethan handed her the bags. "I brought formula, diapers, some clothes, and a few toys, thinking this might help," he said with a softer expression. Mary took the bags, looking at him unsure if she should thank him, cry, or apologize again. She just nodded, completely speechless. Leo was still crying softly, and that sound made Ethan glance inside the apartment. He took a deep breath, and his stern expression began to soften. "May I come in?" he asked, still trying to understand how her life had taken such a turn in just a few minutes. Mary opened the door wider and gestured with her hand, "Of course, please come in." He stepped inside, looking around. The apartment was small but clean and tidy, despite the clear signs of hardship. They sat down on the small sofa in the living room. A few seconds of silence filled the space, then Ethan, observing every detail carefully, asked, "Do you really work at Walker Enterprises?" Mary nodded nervously, wringing her hands in her lap. "Yes, I started 2 weeks ago as a cleaning lady." His eyes widened in surprise. "Really, what a coincidence. I am the CEO of Walker Enterprises," he said, crossing his arms as if trying to process that information. Mary's face flushed, she lowered her head in shame, holding back words, unsure what to say. The silence in the room was almost palpable. Mary still didn't know if this was real or a bizarre dream. How could she go from sending a mistaken text to sitting in her living room, face to face with Ethan, the CEO of the company where she cleaned offices, all in a matter of minutes? Ethan silently observed everything, his eyes sweeping over every detail of the small apartment, but most of all, he was looking at Leo, who was now calm, diligently drinking his bottle as if completely oblivious to anything else happening. For a few moments, Ethan remained silent, as if in deep thought, then he took another deep breath, uncrossed his arms, and sat up straighter on the sofa. "Mary," he began, his voice softer but still firm, "may I be direct?" She just nodded. "I don't like to see an employee of mine, or rather, a mother, go through something like this. It's not right," he said, looking straight into her eyes, "and I want to make you an offer." Mary's eyes widened in surprise. "An offer?" she repeated, almost speechless. Ethan took another deep breath and then, without hesitation, said, "I want you to stop working as a cleaning lady. I want you to come work directly with me as my personal assistant." She stood frozen for a few seconds. His words didn't seem to make sense. "I'm sorry, what?" she asked, frowning, thinking she must have misunderstood. "You heard right," he confirmed, still serious. "Much higher salary, excellent benefits, health insurance, childcare support, more flexible hours, you'll have stability and, more importantly, you'll be able to take better care of your son." Mary blinked a few times, trying to wrap her head around whether this was actually happening. Instinctively, she shook her head in refusal. No, I can't accept this. This is too much. I'm not qualified for that job, sir. I have no experience," she replied, utterly flustered. Ethan took a deep breath, crossed his arms, and replied firmly, "Mary, forget that way of thinking. You are smart, hard-working, and you know why I know that. Because no one, absolutely no one, could handle what you're facing right now unless they were truly capable. She clasped her hands, struggling with her pride. But what about other people? They'll think I got this job out of pity, or... Her voice was almost a whisper. Before she could finish, Ethan cut her off decisively. Let me tell you something, this isn't about what other people think, it's about what you need. And honestly, Mary, this isn't just for you, it's for Leo. That boy needs a mother who can give him a better life, and you can't let pride stop you from accepting help. She took a deep breath and looked at her son, who was sleeping peacefully after crying so much. That tiny, serene face, in that moment, seemed to be the only thing that mattered in the world. For a few seconds, she wrestled with herself, her pride trying to scream louder, but her love for Leo was stronger. Mary bowed her head, closed her eyes, and with a shaky voice said, "Okay, I accept." Ethan smiled faintly and nodded, "Excellent decision. Starting tomorrow, you're no longer part of the cleaning staff, you'll be working directly in my office. Don't worry, we'll train you, guide you, you'll do fine, I'm sure of it." She took another deep breath, feeling a mix of relief, gratitude, and at the same time, a deep fear of the unknown. "Thank you, truly, I don't know what to say," she murmured, still overwhelmed. Ethan stood up, adjusted his jacket, and looked at Leo once more. For a few moments, he just looked at the baby with an expression Mary couldn't quite read, something between tenderness, nostalgia, and sadness. "All right," he said, turning back to her, "get some rest tonight. Tomorrow at 9 a.m., I'll be waiting for you at the main Walker Enterprises building, room 28, top floor. And please," he added, a slight smile playing on his lips, "don't be late." Mary gave a nervous laugh and nodded, "I won't." He turned, walked to the door, and just before leaving, looked at her one last time. "You have more potential than you realize, Mary, you just need to believe in yourself." And with that, he opened the door and disappeared into the night. The moment the door closed, Mary collapsed onto the sofa, burying her face in her hands and taking a deep breath. She looked at Leo, still sleeping peacefully, and for the first time in months, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, hope. The alarm clock rang at 6 a.m., but Mary had been awake long before that. In fact, she had barely slept at all. The anxiety mixed with the fear of the unknown made her heart pound so hard it felt like it might burst from her chest. She got up slowly, trying not to wake Leo, who was still sound asleep, his little face serene as she prepared his milk. Her mind was racing, she thought about everything that could go wrong, everything she didn't know how to do, the fear of disappointing Ethan or, worse, losing the opportunity that could change her and her son's lives. Looking at Leo, she took a deep breath, and amidst all those emotions, she managed a small smile. She whispered softly, like a silent promise, "I'll do this for you, my love, all for you." She took a shower, tied her hair back, and chose the best outfit she had, a simple white shirt, black trousers, and a pair of flat shoes. She looked in the mirror, adjusted her hair, and tried to convince herself that she was ready. "It's not about how I look," she thought, "it's about courage." At 8:30, she dropped Leo off with Ms. Evelyn, the kind neighbor who had offered to watch him. Leo was fine, calm, and that gave her a little more peace of mind. Soon, she was walking toward the subway station, each step heavier than the last, not because she was tired, but because her mind was filled with doubts, insecurities, and the silent fear of not fitting in. When she got off at the stop near Walker Enterprises headquarters, she hopped a deep breath and looked up at the skyscraper that seemed to touch the sky. The building was too large, too elegant, too imposing for her not to feel even smaller standing before it. She walked through the glass doors, trying to appear confident even though she was trembling inside. The receptionist looked up and smiled, a polite, professional smile that quickly turned curious when she heard her name. "Good morning, I'm Mary, I have an appointment with Mr. Ethan." The woman typed quickly on her computer, and the moment Mary's name appeared, her eyes widened slightly. She quickly smiled back, warmer this time, "Of course, Ms. Mary, elevator number 3, top floor, room 28. Mary thanked her and walked toward the elevator. As she went up, She stared at her own reflection in the mirrored walls, trying to convince herself that she could do this, that she belonged here, even though her heart was telling her otherwise. When the doors opened, a long corridor stretched out before her. Everything seemed shiny, the floors spotless, glass walls, a panoramic view of the city. At the end of the hallway was a door with a small plaque, CEO Ethan. She knocked lightly. "Come in," a deep, steady voice from the other side replied. The moment she stepped inside, her eyes found Ethan, who was standing looking at some papers on a side table. When he saw her, he smiled faintly and said, "On time, I like that." He walked to the main desk and gestured for her to sit. Mary complied, adjusting nervously on the chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Starting today, you'll be working directly with me. Your job title is personal executive assistant, and before you ask, yes, we will train you on everything: scheduling, meeting coordination, travel arrangements, documents, contracts, everything related to my professional work." She nodded, trying to absorb every word, even though her mind was still trying to process whether this was actually happening. "Okay, Mary's heart started racing, her hands were sweaty. She looked over at Leo, who was playing innocently on the rug with no idea of what was happening, and she felt a knot tighten in her chest. Fear took over every part of her body. She tried to ignore it, took a deep breath, put her phone away, trying to convince herself that Mark just wanted to scare her. But as the days went by, she realized it wasn't just that, Mark was serious about his threats. She started noticing strange things: an unfamiliar car parked at the corner near her building, always at the same time, a man she recognized from a distance, one of Mark's friends, someone she knew wasn't trustworthy, walking down the street staring straight up at her apartment window. The messages kept coming: "I told you, if you won't do things my way, we'll settle this in court, and you know I can make your life a living hell, Mary. So you're hanging around with rich folks now, huh? Well, then, give me some money and I'll disappear." Every message felt like a stab in the chest, and with the fear came anger. How could someone be this cruel? After being gone for so long, how could he come back just to take advantage of her? And that same week, as if dealing with Mark wasn't enough, another problem showed up, this time at work. It started quietly. Mary was organizing weekly reports, keeping track of Ethan's schedule, and reviewing documents when something in a financial spreadsheet caught her eye. There was a strange transaction, a number that didn't make sense. At first, she thought it might be a simple mistake, but as she looked closer, she realized it wasn't just one. There were several small amounts that, when added together, turned into a pretty significant sum. Mary pulled reports from previous months, and as she kept digging, it became clear this wasn't a coincidence. Something was wrong, something big. She brought the information to Ethan, pointing out the inconsistencies. At first, he stayed silent, staring at the screen. Then he crossed his arms, took a deep breath, and said, This isn't right. These transactions shouldn't be here." Immediately, he started pulling more data. With every file he opened, more red flags showed up: small transfers to unknown accounts, payments that weren't properly recorded, invoices with no explanation. Mary, her hands trembling, watched, feeling a chill run down her spine. "Do you think someone's stealing from the company?" she asked, her voice barely there. Ethan narrowed his eyes, clenched his jaw, and answered, his voice deep and full of concern, "I don't think. I'm almost sure." They spent hours going through the data, line after line, spreadsheet after spreadsheet. More proof kept surfacing, and the more they looked, the clearer it became: this wasn't a one-time mistake, this had been happening for a long time. "This is way bigger than I thought," Ethan muttered, typing quickly, cross-checking information, looking for patterns. Even with her personal life falling apart, Mary stayed focused, helping him, digging through the data, taking notes. She knew how serious this was, it could affect the entire company. But deep inside, the fear kept growing, because while she was dealing with this crisis at work, she knew Mark was still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. And at that moment, one thing became painfully clear: her life would never be the same again. Ethan kept his eyes glued to the computer screen, moving from one report to another, cross-checking data, analyzing every suspicious transaction. Mary sat beside him, following every detail, writing down notes and gathering more information. "This is worse than I thought," he said, crossing his arms, still staring at the screen. "These transfers aren't recent, someone's been doing this for years." Mary, scanning another spreadsheet, looked up at him. "And it's all very well planned. Each transaction looks small on its own, but when you add it up, it's huge, Ethan." "Huge," he agreed, rubbing his hands over his face, visibly frustrated. "And whoever did this knows the company's internal systems inside and out. This isn't someone from the outside." She typed a few more commands and pulled up older reports. "These entries, they all have to be manually approved, right?" "Exactly, and to do that, you need high-level access," he replied, his expression getting darker. "Only 3 people have full access, me, the CFO, and Victor." When Ethan said the name, Mary immediately noticed the weight it carried. She looked at him, trying to figure out if this was just a suspicion or if, deep down, he already knew exactly who was behind it. "Victor Carter?" she asked, just to be sure. Ethan nodded slowly, pressing his lips together. "My business partner for over 10 years, someone I always trusted, or at least thought I could trust." Mary watched his face and noticed something she'd never seen before: disappointment. This wasn't just about business, it was personal. "Do you think it's him?" she asked, looking straight into his eyes. It took Ethan a few seconds to answer. "I don't want to think so, but the numbers are telling me otherwise, and honestly, numbers don't usually lie." She took a deep breath, pulled out another report, and studied it. "There's more here. Look at this transaction. It follows the same pattern as the other irregularities, and guess who signed off on it?" He looked. The name was right there, clear as day: Victor Carter. Ethan clenched his jaw. "So that's it," he muttered, crossing his arms. "Victor's been stealing from us for years, and he wasn't even trying that hard to hide it." Mary stayed quiet for a few moments. She watched his expression, the subtle changes in his face, and then she realized she was watching him a little too closely. She looked back at the screen. "So what do we do now?" she asked, trying to sound professional, though the worry in her voice still showed. "The first thing is to make sure he doesn't know we figured it out," Ethan said, turning his chair to face her. "And the second," he paused, looking directly into her eyes, "is for you to stay right where you are, here with me, helping me." She froze for a moment, her heart was beating faster than it should. "Of course," she replied quickly, looking away, "you can count on me." For a moment, the room went silent. But it wasn't an awkward silence, there was something in the air, a different kind of tension, hard to explain, something beyond what they were talking about. "Are you okay?" he asked suddenly, his voice softer. She was caught off guard by the question. "Me?" She blinked. "Yes, why wouldn't I be?" "Because I know you're dealing with more than you should," he said, looking into her eyes in a way that made her heart skip a beat. "I saw it at the cafe, that man, he's Leo's father, isn't he?" Mary looked away at once, wringing her hands in her lap. "I didn't want you to know. I didn't want to drag you into my problems." "Mary," he leaned in slightly, his tone calm but firm. "You're already part of my life whether you like it or not, and if someone's threatening you, following you, that's my business too." She took a deep breath, pressing her lips together, fighting the urge to fall apart right there. But she couldn't let herself seem weak. I'm trying to handle it, Ethan, really." "You don't have to handle it alone," he said, folding his arms and locking eyes with her, making sure she heard every word. "I'm here. I'm not going to let anyone touch you or Leo." Their eyes met for a few seconds. The reports, the numbers, the fraud, Victor, all of it faded. It felt like only the two of them existed in that moment. Mary realized she was holding her breath, and Ethan was so close that if she leaned in just a little. But he looked away first and stood up from his chair. We need stronger evidence. I want to bring Victor down with everything we've got. She felt both relieved and disappointed in herself for even imagining something that clearly wasn't going to happen. I can dig through older transactions, cross-check the supplier contracts, maybe we'll find a pattern. Perfect, he said, already back at the computer. If anyone can do that, it's you. The hours passed, and the two of them became completely absorbed in their work. As the investigation progressed, it became more and more clear that Victor wasn't just stealing, it was an elaborate scheme, fake companies, inflated contracts, and money transfers to foreign accounts. Ethan studied each new discovery with a mix of anger and disbelief. He did all this right under my nose for years, he muttered, clenching his fists, and I didn't see it. This isn't your fault, Mary said, looking right at him. The only one who should be ashamed is the one who did it. He looked at her, held her gaze longer than he should have, and smiled a small smile, but one filled with meaning. You have no idea how much you've meant to me through all of this. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. She just smiled awkwardly, her heart racing again. When they finally looked at the clock, they realized the whole day had gone by. It was already night. I think we need to eat something, Ethan said, getting up. I don't know about you, but I'm starving. She laughed. I don't think I even had lunch today. He smiled. Come on, let me take you to dinner. Dinner? She asked, a bit surprised. Like, right now? Right now. You deserve it, and honestly, so do I. She hesitated for a few seconds, but then smiled, grabbed her bag, and stood up. Okay, that's fine. They left together, talking, laughing, as if for a few hours they could forget about Victor, the problems, the threats, and everything else that was going on. And as they walked side by side, Ethan glanced at her discreetly and thought that of all the things that could have happened in his life, meeting Mary was definitely not part of his plans, but somehow, it was becoming the part he least wanted to give up. The feeling that something was about to explode became impossible to ignore. Ever since they uncovered the fraudulent activities, the atmosphere at the company had become suffocating. Mary and Ethan spent days buried in the investigation, cross-checking data, gathering evidence, piecing together the puzzle that exposed Victor in a way that left no doubt. But the deeper they dug, the clearer it became that Victor was playing too, and he played dirty. That morning, Ethan received an urgent notification from the company's internal system. Confidential data which should have never left his control had been compromised. He opened the report and saw something that made his stomach turn. There were records of bank transfers that appeared to have come from him, millions of dollars sent to offshore accounts directly linked to the same shell companies they had identified as part of Victor's scheme. This can't be happening, he muttered, clenching his jaw, his eyes scanning the screen. I never made these transfers. Mary stepped closer, looked at the data, and felt her whole body go cold. This is serious. These records look authentic. They're under your login, in your name. He shook his head, clenching his fists. This is fake. It's a setup. He planted this. He wants to frame me. Mary pulled another report, trying to figure out how it had been done. They manipulated the system records. This looks like it's been in the works for a long time. The office doors suddenly burst open. 3 board members walked in, accompanied by a lawyer. Their expressions were hard, serious, almost hostile. Ethan, we need to talk, one of them said, making no effort to hide the accusing tone in his voice. We've received an extremely troubling report. We need you to step down temporarily as president while we investigate these transactions. The shock hit instantly. Mary looked at Ethan, then at the board members, her heart racing. This is ridiculous, she tried to say, but Ethan raised his hand, signaling her not to speak. He stood up from his chair, crossed his arms, and stared at the men. Do you really believe I'd steal money from my own company? The lawyer held a folder thick with documents. The evidence is strong, Mr. Walker. It's in the system, under your authorization. This was planted, he said through clenched teeth, and I'll prove it. Until everything is cleared up, we're asking you to leave your position and the building immediately, one of the directors stated, holding firm. If you refuse, we'll have to take legal action. Mary held her breath, wrapping her arms around herself, trying to understand if this was really happening. This is a trap, and you're all falling for it, Ethan replied, walking over to his desk and gathering a few things. Don't worry, this isn't over. He looked at Mary, who stood there pale and scared, and just shook his head, silently telling her to stay calm. They left the office together, walking down the hallway under judging eyes, whispers and murmurs that felt like knives cutting through the air. Inside the elevator, Ethan stayed silent for a few seconds. Then he took a deep breath and, with a more controlled voice, said, "Victor's desperate. This just proves he knows we're getting too close to the truth." "But what now?" Mary asked, her voice almost breaking. Can they have you arrested?" "No, not yet, but that's what he wants. He wants me out, discredited, destroyed." When they got to the parking garage, he grabbed her arm gently, looked her in the eyes, and said, "This doesn't change anything. We keep going, and now we fight even harder." While they were still trying to process everything that had just happened, Mary got a message that made her blood run cold. It was from Mark. "Either you fix this fast or I'll take you to court, and not just that, I've got powerful friends now and trust me they know exactly how to make you lose everything." Her body froze, her hands started to sweat, her vision blurred. She showed her phone to Ethan, who read the message and squeezed it so tightly it looked like he might crush it. "They're working together," he said through clenched teeth. "Victor and Mark. It all makes sense now." Mary held Leo in her arms, who was sleeping peacefully, completely unaware of what was happening. Her whole world felt like it was about to collapse. He's going to try to take Leo away from me," she whispered. "No, he won't." Ethan's voice was so steady, so firm that for a moment she almost believed him. "I promise you, they won't." She looked at him, searching for strength where she had none left. "But what if they do, Ethan? What if I lose you, lose my job, lose my son?" Ethan gently cupped her chin, making her look straight into his eyes. "Look at me. You are not losing anything. Do you hear me? I won't let that happen. I won't let them take anything from you, Mary. Not you, not Leo, not your life." For a few long seconds, their eyes stayed locked, and in that moment, nothing else seemed to matter. She felt this overwhelming urge to just throw herself into his arms, as if that simple gesture could shield her from all the chaos around them. But she couldn't, not yet. "So what do we do now?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Now we fight back." Back at her apartment, papers, files, and folders were spread out everywhere. Ethan paced back and forth while Mary worked to organize the information. "We need to prove these records are fake," she said, looking up at him, "and fast." "I agree, and more than that, we need to expose Victor before he has a chance to do anything else." "And what about Mark?" she asked, gripping her phone tightly, staring at the latest string of threatening messages. "He's using this to pressure me." Ethan stopped pacing, walked over to her, and held her hands. "Mary, look at me. He's not going to take your son away from you. You know why? Because now you're not alone." Her chest tightened, a mix of fear, anxiety, and a strange sense of relief knowing he was there, that she didn't have to face this alone. I'm so scared of losing Leo," she said, feeling the tears welling up. Ethan cupped her face with both hands. "That's not going to happen, do you understand me? It's not." She closed her eyes for a few seconds, taking a deep breath, trying to absorb every word. When she opened them again, she found his eyes so close. For a moment, She thought he was about to kiss her, but instead, he just smiled softly, brushing his thumbs gently over her cheeks. "You are stronger than you think, Mary." And in that moment, as they looked at each other, they both knew they were in this together, no matter what came next. The next day, Ethan paced back and forth, eyes locked on his phone, gripping it like he was holding more than just a device. Mary sat at the table, reviewing the reports once more, while Leo slept on the couch, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit. She watched Ethan, trying to figure out if his silence was fear, worry, or something even deeper. Then suddenly, he stopped, took a deep breath, and spoke with a firmness that made her whole body tense. "Enough. I think it's time you know everything." Mary dropped the papers immediately and stared at him. "Know what?" He sat down in front of her, crossed his arms on the table, and looked at her like he needed her trust now more than ever. "I've been suspicious of Victor for a lot longer than you think, actually, since last year, but I could never prove it." Her eyes widened. You already knew." "I suspected, but there was no proof." It all started to make sense when a few overpriced contracts showed up, small transactions that on paper looked normal, and there was no way to report anything without solid evidence because he always knew how to cover his tracks. Mary leaned in, gripping his arm. "So when we started looking into this, you already..." He nodded slowly. "Yes. And not just that, I'm not doing this alone, Mary. I've been secretly working with the FBI." The shock hit her so hard it took a few seconds to process what she had just heard. "The FBI?" "That's right. They've been monitoring Victor for months, but they needed someone on the inside, someone like me, to provide detailed information they couldn't get otherwise. And now, with everything you've uncovered, we're closer than ever to bringing this down." Mary brought her hands to her mouth, trying to control the wave of anxiety rushing through her. "Oh my God. You trusted me with this?" Ethan held her hands tightly. "Since day one. And honestly, if it weren't for you, I don't think I would have made it this far." She swallowed hard, squeezing his hands back. "Okay, so what do we do now?" He looked into her eyes, so close that for a second she thought he might kiss her right then and there. But instead, he answered with the same steady tone he'd had all along. "Now we set a trap." Mary pulled the reports back out and started matching up the data. "These payments, they follow a pattern. Always on the same days each month, going to the same accounts, which, not surprisingly, are tied to fake companies. If we can track those accounts, we might find the missing link." Ethan nodded, pulling the laptop closer. "What if we set up a fake deal? A big transfer, something he can't ignore. As soon as he goes for it, the FBI steps in." She frowned. "And Mark? He's part of this too." "He is, and that's where it all connects. Victor promised to help Mark get custody of Leo in return. Mark's been trying to shake you up, put pressure on me, threaten you. This isn't just about money, they're trying to take us down." Mary clenched her jaw and crossed her arms. "They're not going to win. I swear they won't." Ethan gently took her chin and made her look at him. "That's it, exactly. They have no idea who they're messing with." She smiled, but it was a shaky smile, because deep down, the fear was still there, tight in her chest, hard to breathe. But there was also something else, a feeling she'd never had before, a sense of safety that didn't come from money or power, but from knowing she wasn't alone anymore. The hours passed, and they both got completely wrapped up in the plan. The FBI was called in. Ethan made the call he'd been putting off for weeks. When the agent answered on the other end, his expression changed completely. "It's time. We're ready. We have everything, the evidence, the records, the transaction patterns, and most importantly, the target." The agent confirmed the operation would be set up within 24 hours. They would have a surveillance room, agents inside the company building, undercover, ready to act as soon as Victor took the bait. Mary helped put together the fake documents, the staged transfer was huge, too big for any thief like Victor to resist. She organized everything with such precision that even Ethan was impressed. "You know," he said, watching her type, "I think you were made for this." She gave a small, modest smile. "I think I was made to survive, Ethan, and somewhere along the way, I ended up learning more than I ever thought I would." His expression softened. For a few seconds, he forgot about the numbers, the contracts, the fraud, he just looked at her. "You're so much more than you realize, Mary." She looked away, feeling her face warm. "You too." Their connection grew stronger with each passing second. In the middle of all the chaos, they were building something they didn't fully understand, but it made perfect sense all the same. Once the plan was set, Ethan held her hands. "From here on out, there's no turning back." She gripped his fingers tightly. "I'm with you all the way." The FBI agent confirmed everything was in place. The trap would be set the next day during a meeting Ethan had requested with Victor, supposedly to discuss an international contract, a fake merger with a multi-million-dollar transfer. Mary handled every detail of the fake contract. Her knowledge of finance, something she had picked up almost by accident since starting as a secretary, was now critical to pulling this off. That night, while they reviewed every line of the contract together, Ethan looked at her, held her hand, and spoke in a quieter voice, almost a whisper, "I don't know where I'd be if you hadn't come into my life." She looked back at him, and for a few moments, words failed her. All she could feel was his gaze, his presence, that connection between them that just kept growing. "Me neither, Ethan." He gently ran his fingers across her hand, as if for a moment he'd forgotten the world, the problems, everything. But before anything else could happen, the laptop alarm went off, reminding them there was still work to do. The next morning, everything was ready. The office felt quieter than usual, like even the employees sensed something was off. Mary and Ethan arrived early, accompanied by two undercover agents who took their places inside the company. Victor arrived on time with the same confident smile as always, like nothing could touch him. He sat down in the conference room, opened his laptop, reviewed the contracts, and when he saw the numbers, his eyes lit up. "So this is it?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "An international merger?" Ethan nodded. "An opportunity that could change everything." Victor studied the clauses, gave a slight smirk, and started typing on his laptop. "And when is this transfer supposed to happen?" "Now," Mary answered, not taking her eyes off him. He looked at her, smiling like he underestimated her. An assistant talking about millions? Who would have thought, huh? But at that very moment, what he didn't know was that everything he typed was being monitored. Every click, every attempt to authorize the transfer, every move was being tracked in real time by federal agents. The plan worked. As soon as Victor tried to authorize the transaction, internal alarms went off. The conference room door burst open, and FBI agents stormed in. "Victor Carter, you're under arrest." His face lost all color. "This is a mistake. This is a setup." "No," Ethan said, crossing his arms and looking straight at him, "this is called justice." As the agents restrained Victor, Ethan stood there, arms crossed, eyes fixed on him. There was no satisfaction in his gaze, just the conviction that he was doing the right thing. Mary stood by his side, holding Leo, her heart racing, unable to look away from the scene that just days ago seemed impossible. "You're all going to regret this," Victor shouted, struggling. "This isn't over." Ethan slowly stepped forward, stopped right in front of him, and said firmly, "This is just the beginning, Victor." As Victor was taken away by the agents, Ethan let out a heavy sigh and looked at Mary. She didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or just collapse right there, it all felt so surreal. "We did it," she whispered with a smile that was part relief, part disbelief. Ethan didn't answer right away. He just reached for her hand, squeezing her fingers so tightly she could feel how hard this had been on him too. "This was only possible because you were by my side." They looked at each other for a few seconds, and in that moment, it felt like everything else faded away, the tension of the last few days, the fear, the threats, all of it seemed to melt in that single look. Ethan leaned in, cupped her face with both hands, and without thinking twice, kissed her. It was intense, full of everything they'd both been holding back for so long. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a promise, a surrender. Mary kissed him back without hesitation, feeling her heart beat so hard she thought it might burst. Her hands gripped his arms like she was afraid the moment might not be real. But it was. It was real. When they finally pulled back, they looked at each other, a little awkward, both smiling like they knew that from that point on, nothing would ever be the same. Mary, Ethan started, still holding her face, I don't know exactly when it happened, but I fell in love with you, Mary. I fell in love with you and with Leo. Her heart tightened. The tears came, but they weren't from sadness, they were from relief, from love, from everything she never thought she'd feel again. I love you too, Ethan. I fell in love with you too, she said, holding his face like she wanted to make sure this was really happening, and thank you for everything, for not giving up on me, on us. The sound of the conference room door opening interrupted the moment. One of the agents walked in quickly, holding some papers. We've got another one, he said, looking at Ethan. The tracked calls and statements from a few employees confirmed that Victor wasn't acting alone. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Mark? The agent nodded. That's right. He's been helping Victor, clearly trying to pressure Mary. He tried to use her son as leverage with threats and blackmail. We've got it all recorded. Mary felt her whole body go cold, even though she'd already suspected it. He's going to pay, isn't he? She asked, her voice shaking. He will, the agent answered, looking at her. The team is on their way to pick him up now. It didn't take long for the news to come in. Mark was arrested right outside his building, completely caught off guard. He tried to resist, denied everything like he always did, but there was nowhere left to run. The messages, the recordings, the screenshots, everything was there, undeniable and inescapable. Mary got the confirmation of his arrest with trembling hands. As much as that news brought relief, it was impossible not to feel in some way emotionally drained by everything she had gone through in the last few days. Ethan held her hand tightly. He's not going to threaten you anymore. Not you, not Leo. It's over. She looked at him, taking a deep breath. Is it really over? She asked, like she needed to hear it one more time. He stepped closer, cupped her face with both hands, and answered, his voice full of conviction, it's over. I promise. They hugged tightly, as if trying to pour every emotion into that one embrace. For the first time in a long while, Mary felt like she could finally breathe. Leo, nestled in her arms, woke up and, as if he somehow understood the worst was behind them, looked at both of them, smiled, and babbled something that made them both laugh. Even he knows everything's okay now, Ethan said, picking Leo up, making him giggle even more. I think you're right, Mary replied, smiling, feeling this warm peace in her chest, something she hadn't felt in a long time. The days that followed felt like something out of a movie. News of the scandal took over the media. Victor was formally charged with fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, and conspiracy. Mark, on the other hand, was charged with blackmail, threats, coercion, attempted kidnapping, and attempted extortion. The company, now free from Victor, began a process of rebuilding. Ethan was officially reinstated as CEO, not just because the evidence cleared his name, but because the shareholders knew the company wouldn't have survived without him. Mary watched everything unfold closely, not as just an assistant anymore, but as someone who had become essential to it all. One late afternoon, when all the legal issues seemed finally resolved, Ethan took her hand, looked into her eyes, and said, I know we've been through so much, and we're still processing it all, but I need you to know, I can't imagine my life without you, without both of you. She smiled, squeezing his hands. Me neither. I know this whole thing started in the craziest way, he continued with a soft smile, but if I get to choose, I want it to keep going our way. Mary laughed, shaking her head. And what exactly is our way, Mr. Ethan? He leaned in, cupped her face, and answered just before kissing her again, the way where I wake up next to you every day. The kiss came full of promises, of certainty, of a future that not long ago had seemed impossible, but now it was right there waiting for them. The days that followed were a mix of relief, rebuilding, and more than anything, hope. With Victor and Mark both behind bars, everything finally seemed to fall into place. For the first time, there were no more threats, no more doubts, no more shadows from the past hanging over them. Walker Enterprises went through quick and decisive changes. With Ethan back in charge, firm decisions were made. Departments were reorganized, some people were let go, contracts were reviewed, and surprisingly, Mary wasn't just watching from the sidelines. Ethan made sure she was by his side in every meeting, every decision, and more than that, he made it clear to the entire board that she wasn't just his soon-to-be wife, she was someone who had been critical to saving the company. Sitting together in the president's office, where it all had basically started, Ethan held her hands, lacing his fingers through hers. I've been thinking, I believe it's time to update your job title. She laughed a bit suspicious. Update it? Director of Internal Audit, he said seriously, looking her straight in the eyes. You've proven to everyone here that you're more capable than anyone. She blinked, stunned. You're kidding. I'm dead serious. And before you say anything, this isn't a gift, you've earned it, every bit of it. He squeezed her hands. And if you want, you can start today. Her smile was instant. I accept. He leaned in, brushing his lips against hers, whispering, and there's one more position I'd like to offer you. She raised an eyebrow. Oh yeah, what's that? My wife. Forever. Her laughter burst out before she could hold it back, and without thinking twice, she pulled him closer by his tie and kissed him like the whole world depended on it. The wedding preparations began right away, not because they were in a rush, but because they both knew there was no reason to wait anymore. All they wanted was to celebrate this love that had started in the most unexpected way but had become the most certain thing in both their lives. The guest list was small and intimate, made up only of people who were truly part of their journey. Employees from the company who had become close friends, a few neighbors, and of course Ms. Evelyn, the neighbor who had looked after Leo since the beginning. She was more emotional than anyone else there, as if she were family, and in many ways, she was. On the morning of the wedding, Mary stood in front of the mirror looking at her reflection. For the first time in her life, she felt like the person she was meant to be, not the girl who fought against the world, not the cleaning lady who held back tears just to make ends meet. She was a woman who had made it, a woman who was loved. When the doors opened and she saw Ethan at the altar, her eyes filled with tears. He was standing there smiling as if the whole world had paused for that one perfect moment. Leo, dressed in a little suit, walked down the aisle carrying the rings, looking very serious, though he drew laughter and a few tears from everyone around. Ethan never looked away from her, not even for a second, and when she reached him, he took her hands and held them tightly, as if making a silent promise that nothing would ever come between them. The officiant smiled before beginning. There are stories that seem to be written by chance, but in truth, they're living proof that love always finds a way. Mary felt her chest tighten. When she looked at Ethan, she saw he felt the same. He was holding back tears too, but smiling like he knew deep in his heart that this was the best day of their lives. When it came time for the vows, Ethan gently held her face, ignoring everyone else, and spoke softly, just to her, I promise, in front of everyone, but most of all in front of you, to love you, protect you, and make you happy for the rest of my life. Mary took a deep breath and held his hands. I promise to love you on all the easy days, but especially on the hard ones. I promise to be your peace, your strength, your home, and I promise that as long as I live, you'll never be alone again. As they exchanged rings, the world seemed to disappear. All that remained was their love. And when the officiant said, "You may kiss the bride," they kissed as if it were their very first kiss and the most important one of their lives. The reception reflected who they were, full of joy, love, and lightness. Ethan danced with Leo in his arms while Mary laughed watching them, thinking that if there was such a thing as perfection, this was it. Later, during a quiet moment while the guests were distracted, Ethan took her hand and led her out to the garden, glowing with hundreds of tiny white lights. He gently pulled her closer. "You know, I don't think I've ever been as happy in my life as I am right now." She smiled and touched his face. "Me neither. I'll never get tired of saying, Ms. Mary," he leaned in closer, their noses touching, "I love you. I love you more than I ever thought I could love anyone." She held on to his jacket, smiling. "And I love you, Ethan. You and Leo are my life, my home, my everything." They kissed there under the lights, knowing this wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning of everything. Then Leo's voice rang out, "Mom. Dad," and they laughed when they turned to look at him, holding a piece of cake almost too big for him to carry. They laughed so hard they felt like kids again. Ethan scooped up Leo with one arm and held Mary with the other. "Now it's us. A family," he said, looking at them both. "And there's nothing more important in the world than that." As the music played and the guests toasted, danced, and smiled, Mary looked at Ethan, held his hand, and whispered, "That wrong number turned out to be the right one in my life." He smiled and gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "Our lucky number." And together, that day, in that love, they sealed the kind of certainty that only comes from a story written by fate. What did you think of Mary and Ethan's story? Leave your thoughts in the comments. On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate it? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our stories, and click here at the end of the video to watch more touching moments like this.